Welcome. We're just going to admit the last few people and then we'll get started in a couple minutes. Good evening, everybody. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Lily Thomas, and I work for the County of Marin in the Community Development Agency, where I oversee our Housing and Federal Grants Division. And one of the projects that I'm working on is our housing element. And I'm joined tonight by a few other staff, including Aline Tanillian, who's a planner who works with us. She'll be giving part of our presentation. Edgardo Vasquez, who is also a planner with us, and Leslie Lako, a senior planner who's going to be talking about the safety element. And we also have Miguel Moreno, who's our interpreter. Aline, do you want to introduce Miguel and talk about anything that somebody might need to do if they would like interpretation?
Yeah, so we have Miguel here for Spanish interpretation. And if you would need that service, we have a globe at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on the Spanish channel as well to attain that. Edgardo, would you mind very quickly just saying that in Spanish for any Spanish speakers on the call?
Yeah, si gustarían tener esta presentación o escuchar esta presentación en español, tenemos la opción de español abajo en el start.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's go to the next slide, please, or the first slide. Let's go straight to the next one. And we'll go through the agenda. While Aline gets that up, I'll just start walking us through. Tonight, we are here to brief you on the state's comments on our draft housing element. And the we were, let's see, and then we are going to go through some of our proposed amendments to the countywide plan and development code amendments that are needed to implement the housing element. We're going to talk a little bit about the safety element and some of those development code amendments. And then we'll talk about next steps and opportunity to engage, followed by a Q&A. Also, if during the presentation, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And we'll try to answer as we go along, because we do have to end by 7. And if there's anybody that hasn't gotten their question answered, we'll make sure that please drop it in the chat and we'll write you an answer. We'll get back to you. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Before we get started on giving you the updates, just for anybody who may be new and hasn't heard this presentation before, I know that we have a lot of repeat customers tonight, but Aline's going to give us an overview of the housing element so that everybody has that as a background. So let me just pass it over to Aline to give that overview.
Thank you, Lily. So yeah, as Lily mentioned, this is a refresher for those of you that have heard it before and an overview for those who have not. So as some of you know, the housing element needs to be updated every 8 years, and it's required to be reviewed by the state's California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. The housing element is part of a larger plan. It's part of the general plan and what's called the countywide plan for unincorporated Marin. We have an adoption deadline by the end of January of next year, so January 31st of 2023. And the housing element we're going to discuss tonight covers just the unincorporated areas of the county. Each individual jurisdiction is required to complete their own housing element. And as you may have heard in the past, unincorporated Marin's housing unit goal for the next cycle is 3,569 units and about 14,000 for the county as a whole. So this slide provides an overview of the main components of the housing element, beginning with the needs assessment to the left. So this section of the housing element reviews and analyzes demographic trends, housing market trends, in addition to the needs of special needs groups. The next section to the right is affirmatively furthering fair housing, also known as AFFH. This is a newer section to the housing element but is really critical for us to examine in order to promote fair housing choices for all residents of Marin. So this is a lens in which we're looking at the housing element in terms of sites and location of sites, and our programs and policies to, again, ensure fair housing choices for all. The next category here is sites inventory, which receives a lot of attention in this process. This is the actual sites and locations for housing across all the income levels. And last but not least, to the right, programs and policies. This is essentially the implementation plan for the housing element. Some of the main components are listed here, such as looking at programs and policies to increase availability of units, to affirmatively further fair housing, and for special needs populations and market as well. These are the programs that are to be required to be aligned with state law. The one to the left, by right zoning policy, Lily's going to go over this in a couple slides later on. You may have heard this term before. It essentially applies to sites that were identified in previous housing element cycles. There's also a program required to incentivize affordable housing production in addition to streamlining county development timelines. This map, I think most of you have seen before, provides an overview of the candidate housing sites. And as you can see, there are sites in virtually all communities of unincorporated Marin, again, with the goal to affirmatively further fair housing and provide fair housing choices in all neighborhoods of the county in unincorporated for our housing element. We also wanted to just provide a very high level overview of the consequences of non-compliance of the housing element. There's a new HCD unit called the Housing Accountability Unit. This is new, and they'll be examining and reviewing jurisdictions, not only for the adoption aspect of the housing element, but also implementation and monitoring the housing element for years to come. Some other consequences include loss of access to funding opportunities, such as road and transportation funds. This also includes other housing funds from the state as well, such as permanent local housing allocation funds and other matching funds from the state that the county has received to this point. Another consequence that we've seen that's been detailed is the possibility of a lawsuit from the state, which the state has recently done in Southern California, like in Huntington Beach. There's also a requirement for the jurisdiction to update the housing element every 4 years as opposed to 8 years as well. And in addition to this last point, to have the responsibility to plan for additional housing, for more housing than the current RHNA. This is a very high level timeline of this process. We are in the bottom middle bubble here, the 5th bubble. Lily's going to go through this in the next section, but we just received our comment letter from the state, from HCD, and we're preparing for planning and board commission considerations in preparation for adoption at the end of January. Lily?
Thanks, Aline. So before we get into detail, I just wanted to note that, as you will see in our comments from the state, the changes that are needed to meet the legislative requirements generally ask for more data. They ask for information on some local trends, and they ask for some additional analysis. And what we heard from HCD is that the framework of our housing element is strong. In particular, they said that they noted that we had done a really good job on our fair housing work. So that is nice to hear. And that with the level of the changes needed, we can meet our statutory deadline of adopting the housing element in January as planned. So as we can see here, we released the draft of the housing element as required by the state for a 30-day review by the public in June. And we received over 140 comments that were incorporated into the draft of the housing element that was then submitted to the state HCD. And they have, under the statute, they have a 90-day review period, which ended on October 17th. And that's the day that we got the letter from them. So next slide, please. And we have been tracking HCD letters around the Bay Area. There's about 10 jurisdictions that have received their comments before us. And the type of things that we were seeing primarily were around missing information for that affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis that Aline talked about, and the meaningful actions to address the fair housing portion of it. Those are most of the comments. And we were pleased to see that the comments in our area for the fair housing section were fairly minor. They really asked for more data and more kind of local analysis. But again, the framework of that was strong. So we were pleased to see that. Another significant comment that we're seeing from a lot of other jurisdictions is around lack of outreach and public participation, particularly with protected classes under fair housing law and low income and people of color. And so that was not an issue. We are pleased to see that we didn't get any comments about public outreach. So and then a lot of other places are getting extensive comments on sites, and then that lack of concreteness in their programs. And at a high level, we were not getting those kind of comments. So that was nice to see. Next slide, please. So we did receive comments on our needs assessment. They've asked us for some more information. For example, we needed to do more of analysis about folks who were experiencing homelessness and what led them there and kind of what barriers there were. So there was some additional work that we need to do around our needs assessment. In the constraints section, we need to look more at some information around water and sanitary connections, some more information around fees that we charge and that are actually charged by other jurisdictions or other agencies, and how that may impact development. And then resources, or the site section, we got some general comments really wanting more information about, for example, if we are looking at some of our sites that are mixed use or have an existing use on them, are those a constraint to development? They asked for more information about development trends in our county, which is a little bit of a challenge for us because we don't have a lot of development trends. And so what we're doing is looking around at neighboring counties and neighboring cities and towns to get some of that information. And then on the policies and programs, they've asked us to add a little bit more definitive information, definitive timelines, definitive actions on some of our programs. But I would say that the overarching theme in our comment areas was, again, that request for additional data, clarification or data, or some additional analysis. So they were much less significant than we were kind of anticipating them to be. And we are really pleased that we'll be able to stick to the timeline and adopt by the statutory deadline. So that is our takeaway from them. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on and talk about the countywide plan amendments and development code amendments that are needed in order for us to adopt that housing element and remove some barriers to housing. So to start with, we'll start with kind of a higher overview about what the countywide plan is. It is the document that creates the long-term vision for development in the unincorporated part of the county. As many of you know, it was first adopted in 1974, last updated in 2007. And there's three main sections of it. The first is the natural systems and agricultural element, and that's where the safety element that Leslie will be talking about later is incorporated. The built environment element that includes the housing element, and then there's the socioeconomic element. Next slide, please. Then the development code implements the vision and is kind of like the countywide plan is the big picture, and then it gets down to the nitty-gritty with the development code, where it has the specific requirements for development. We talk about the zoning, how many units per acre on a site, the development standards, so what the height or the setback is, and those kind of specifics, and then what the regulations are for processing an application. And we'll be talking about making changes to both of those documents. Next slide, please. So the reason that we're making changes to the countywide plan and the development code are a number of reasons: to ensure fair housing, to reduce barriers to development, particularly multi-unit development as required by state law, to comply with new state housing legislation. The state has been passing new housing legislation every year, so we need to make changes to make sure that we are in conformance with that. And we'll need to make these changes in order to accomplish the regional housing need allocation of over 3,500 new homes that Aline mentioned. And then we need to address some special needs housing. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So there's a number of countywide plan policies that we are proposing to eliminate that will be discussed later this year by the Planning Commission and the board, including removing a policy that requires development at the lowest end of the density range. And that we need to, in order to accomplish the multifamily, the number of multi-unit housing sites that we need. So that will be a change. And then the other change is removing a policy that encourages or requires development to be at the lowest end of the density range in urbanized areas next to cities and towns. And that's a little counterintuitive. And so that we felt like really is kind of going opposite the type of development that we'd like to see, because we're trying to put development that is more urban within our urbanized parts of the county. And so this policy was limiting that. It was intended to kind of encourage cities and towns to annex into them when there's those more dense development, but we haven't seen that. And so we felt it was kind of counter to the type of development that we'd like to see. So let's go to the next slide, please. And then there's a number of changes that are going to be needed to what we're calling our regional sites. We have two large regional sites, St. Vincent's and the Buck Center in unincorporated Novato. And so there's a number of changes that are needed to accommodate housing on those sites. So in St. Vincent's, there's two main things. We'll be focusing development on about 40 acres of that site that are outside our environmentally sensitive areas and are not subject to hazards like sea level rise. And then we're also separating the development capacity from St. Vincent's and Silvera's and just focusing this development on the St. Vincent's portion of the site. Next slide, please. And then on the Buck Center, there's a significant change in that we are adjusting the city center corridor so that this site, which is right next to the freeway, right next to commercial development and the city of Novato, is in the inland or rural corridor, which is really intended to be more ranch land, rural land, And so it's really aligning the corridors to be more realistic with this site, which is right next to the freeway. So that adjustment will be a change to the countywide plan in order to accommodate housing on a portion of that site. And again, the line is just going to be changed so that it can allow housing on that little red portion of the site that you can see there. Next slide, please. Another change to countywide plan policies is around community plans. And sometimes what a community plan does is it sets goals, objectives, and policies and programs for that are very specific to a community. But some aspects of our community plans are inconsistent with state law and have the effect of limiting multi-unit housing. And so the change that is being proposed there is to say that community plans will retain their role except where there's a conflict with countywide plan as it relates to development standards. And in that case, the countywide plan will prevail. So that's a change in the countywide plan. And sorry, this is a little wonky, but we wanted to make sure that we walk through each of these and then we can answer questions that may come up. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So before I talk about some of the development code changes, I wanted to mention the HCD requirement that in order for a site to be to demonstrate feasibility for a site for lower income housing, we need to have sites that are at least zoned at our default density. And so that's 20 units an acre. So they need to be at least 20 units an acre. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's one of the requirements to demonstrate feasibility for lower income units. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another requirement that we'll be making changes to accommodate in the zoning code is by right. And what that means is that the approval process doesn't go through the same discretionary process that we normally do, that a project, if it has a percentage of affordable units, then it can be approved ministerially as long as it meets those standards. And this again aligns with state law. If we need to have this tool. So for example, if we reuse a housing element site that hasn't developed in the past, then we have to allow development on that site to be by right. And it's a tool for encouraging, housing that includes affordable housing with it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so we are looking at a number of our sites and we're going to rezone them so that they can accommodate lower income. And this is an example of kind of how that would work. So if we have this 10-acre parcel and we had done the analysis, and on that 10-acre parcel, about 4.5 acres of it were feasible for development. They were outside of all of the constraints like the stream or the ridges, and it wasn't too steep. Then if we rezoned that density between 20 to 30 units an acre, then we could accommodate the 90 units, and then we could show those 90 units in our housing element. And so that portion of that 10-acre site would be rezoned to allow a higher density, the portion of the site that was deemed that was deemed more feasible and developable. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it over to Leslie, and she's going to give us an update on the safety element.
Thanks, Lily. So can we stay on that one slide for a minute, Aline? Thanks. The safety element is a lot less controversial than the housing element. And it really covers a lot of ground. So I'm not going to walk you through all of the programs and policies. You guys would be asleep by the time I ended. I'm going to take you quickly through the countywide plan portion, mostly to update you about where we're at this point. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on our development code update. So next slide, Aline. So first of all, why are we doing the safety element along with the housing element? There's a new requirement, for one thing, that we have to update the safety element every 8 years with the housing element, but the safety element makes housing safer. It makes new housing safer. It does that by improving general safety throughout the county. It also does that with programs and policies that have specific development requirements so that new housing will be constructed safely. And it also does that by planning for equitable protection from environmental hazards and especially climate change hazards. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there's a new requirement to update the safety element every 8 years. The focus of that new requirement is on climate change adaptation and resilience. And the first step in that process is to prepare a vulnerability assessment. So we did that. We assessed the vulnerability of unincorporated Marin County, and in some cases, all of Marin County, to environmental hazards that are either new with climate change or will be exacerbated by climate change. And the draft safety element really focuses on those impacts. We also identified a number of vulnerable populations that are more vulnerable to climate change than other populations. And we focused the draft safety element on those populations as well. Next slide. So the existing safety element covers geologic seismicity, flooding, and wildfire. And the updated safety element, the draft safety element, includes a new section on equity, an expanded section on wildfire to address the increased danger associated with climate change, a new section on disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and then a new section on climate change adaptation and resiliency planning. And there we address sea level rise, severe weather, extreme heat, and drought. So, like I said, we cover a lot of ground in the safety element. Next slide. One of the programs in the safety element it instructs us to update the Bayfront Conservation Combining District. So this is part of our development code, and it's an area that has code that you combine with other zoning designations. So you can think of it more as an overlay on other zoning designations. It's been around for a long time, so it's not a new combining district. The original purpose was to protect habitat and to protect public safety and also view sheds. The amendment will focus on the protection of people, property, and habitat from sea level rise. Next slide. Now, the Bayfront Conservation Combining District is shown here in that orangey gold color. And as you can see, it's not a clean swath of shoreline along the entire bay. It's really just those areas of unincorporated Marin County that come in contact with the bay. Now, the other thing that's shown here on this map is the blue hatching, and that represents 3.3 feet of sea level rise where it comes on land there. The part of the amendment the area that the amendment addresses, is the intersection between the blue hatched area and the gold areas. So you can see in some of those areas, we cover the entire Bayfront Conservation Combining District, but in other areas, we're just covering part of it. Next slide. So what we've done in the amendments is we've identified specific sea level rise scenarios. so that we can identify that area. And in the safety element, we have a program that requires us to use scenarios that are consistent with state guidance. And the most recent state guidance is to use about 3.3 feet of sea level rise. So that's why we chose 3.3 feet of sea level rise for our area of inundation. We're also requiring that new and habitable development is sited upland and as high as possible. So this only applies to new and habitable development. And furthermore, we're requiring that any applications for shoreline protection devices need to assess the feasibility of nature-based measures. And only if a nature-based measure is infeasible do we then allow any hard shoreline protection. Finally, we're asking people to record a document acknowledging the risk and liability of developing in a future sea level rise inundation area. So those are the four major parts of the amendment, and that concludes my part of the presentation.
Thanks, Leslie. So let's go to the next slide. So our next steps in relation to the comments from the state are we are addressing those in the draft. We'll meet with them to just walk through, and that's kind of an informal process. We'll walk through what our responses are and get any feedback or concurrence that they may have. And then the board will be finalizing the sites list on December 6th, and then we'll be preparing our public drafts for adoption in January. Let's go to the next slide, please. These are some upcoming opportunities for public input. Our draft environmental review hearing is on the 15th of November, and that's where people can give comments and feedback on the draft environmental review document that covers both the housing and safety element. We have a workshop with First Five to talk about what happens after the housing element and beyond adoption, like what do we do next year? And then that sites meeting with the Board of Supervisors on December 6th to address any changes. You know, we have some additional information or the status of a site has changed. So there might be some small changes made to the sites list from what has currently been contemplated. And then we have these community workshops, including tonight. Then we'll be repeating the same information through a series of these around the county to make sure that people are updated on where we're at with the state and what our approach or our recommended approach is around the countywide plan and development code changes. And let's see, I think that ends our presentation. We're now going to go to any questions or comments that you may have. If you can just raise your Zoom hand, or if you can't find it, if you just wave at us. I'm thinking, Aline, maybe you can manage that part of it. And if there's a question that I'll just, we can direct the questions around. Let's see. Looks like there's a question in the chat.
I also see that Harriet Moss you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and go off mute.
Okay, can I ask my question?
Yes.
Please.
So Lily, can you explain a little bit more about the density requirements for affordable housing?
Yes. So under state law, they use density as a proxy for affordability. And what that means is that in order to be able to say that a site is feasible for affordable housing, it has to be at a certain density. And so those densities are established by the state, and for Marin County, for the unincorporated county, our default density as that the state uses to demonstrate whether it's feasible for affordable housing is 20 units an acre. So it needs to be at least 20 units an acre. Some of our sites may be at a higher density, but it has to be at least at 20. And the reason for that is really when you start to look at economies of scale, that given the high cost of land and development, that if you can only do, 10 homes on an acre, you still have to buy that acre of land, and that stays the same. But if you can develop 30 homes on that, then you're spreading that cost. And this is oversimplification of it, but you're able to spread that cost across all of those units rather than, the 30 units rather than the 10. And also, as you may have heard from some of our affordable housing developers, to be able to manage affordable housing, the more units you have, then you can spread the cost of managing them across more units. And that also makes it more feasible from the ongoing management.
So does that only apply to sites that the county is developing or developing with
Nope.
private developers? Because obviously that doesn't, I don't understand how that relates to our reality in coastal West Marin, where that density just doesn't really exist.
Right. So there's two things I think that we need to keep in mind is sometimes, so in order for us to include a site on the housing element that we demonstrate is feasible for lower income, it needs to be zoned at least 20 units an acre. That doesn't mean that there may be other small sites in West Marin that are not at that density that could develop with affordable housing. There's nothing that says that you can't do it, but in order to demonstrate to the state that a site is feasible for lower income, you have to have that default density. And there's other requirements, like it has to be the parcel has to be a certain size, right? So it can't be too big or too small. And that's also a feasibility thing for affordable housing. You have to be able to have a certain number of units on it to demonstrate it. So they really want to see something that's based on kind of a larger development pattern, that could get tax credits, that could be managed by a larger development. And that's what they're using to demonstrate feasibility. But that doesn't mean that you can't also have other types of housing that is affordable and develops in different ways around the community, as we've seen in many parts of West Marin.
Great. We have a question from Alan.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for this forum. And I've been following things, and I'm really impressed with the housing element. And I've no doubt that the county is going to get to the finish line and there's going to be an approved element. My question has to do with the companion process, and that's whether are finance people, both for-profit and nonprofits, being consulted as to whether people are going to step forward and finance projects, and are developers being consulted that these projects are going to pencil out? I just wonder if, I know there's consequences, and that's a new thing with this housing element this year, but the pattern is that when you have consequences like that, it kind of devolves into lawsuits and bankruptcies and things, and you don't actually get any housing out of it. You do get a lot of litigation. And so I'm wondering, are people consulting with the teams that are going to marshal the resources and show up at the site and actually build something? Is that a companion process here? Or is this simply a plan that's a precursor to that, but that whole world is still ahead of us?
So I would say that, yes, this is a plan. That's the requirement. This is a planning document that we really evaluating our zoning, evaluating our constraints. And part of that process was to consult with affordable housing developers to hear about what constraints, what what interests them in development, any recommendations they had around policy changes. So that was also part of the conversation. And we've done that both through a kind of a larger regional process where we met with developers with our cities and towns so that they could benefit from that. So yes, it's both of those. And I would just note that even when we have the zoning in place and we have removed the constraints that we've identified to development, the issue is still there, as you're mentioning, Ellen, about funding. And one of the constraints that we have in this community is that we don't have an ongoing source of a dedicated source of funding like many of the other counties do, where they have a parcel tax, or, you know, we have the transit occupancy tax just in West Marin, but it's a fairly small stream of funding when you think about how expensive it is to develop. So that continues to be a constraint to development, is that lack of an ongoing dedicated funding source. Although our board has put additional funds in the county's housing fund, and you know, but I would just recognize that as an ongoing constraint.
Thank you.
If others want to raise if you want to raise your hand, you can ask your question verbally, but I'll read some of the questions in the chat, Lily. We can answer some of those. So Kim Thompson asked, how applicable is 20 units per acre for the West Marin environment? What does county staff think about how this can be applied by local housing developers, not for management, but for development?
So, you know, we do have some sites in West Marin that will be zoned at 20 units an acre. And of course, as we all know, the constraint is going to be septic, and that being able to have septic on a site is really, that's going to be the constraint more than the zoning in West Marin. And so I would say that one of the things that we're looking at is, are there any ways that we can cut down that expense? We had a grant through the Senate Bill 2, which is a planning source of planning funds, that came from the state. And we've been doing some evaluations of, are there ways that we could reduce, like kind of had some pre-approved type plans so that we can reduce that cost of septic. So I think that that's one of the things that we'll have to do to make things more feasible for West Marin, and that will continue to be one of the major constraints that will really govern the number of units that could be developed on the site.
Thanks, Lily. Oh, Suzanne, you've got your hand up. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Lily, and everyone for all the excellent work that you've all been doing on this. This is another question of, I guess, having to do with density. I had assumed that all of West Marin was characterized as rural, but I really recently heard that Woodacre is a census designated urban location. What implication does that have for what we're trying to do here?
So the distinction with Woodacre, as opposed to the rest of West Marin, or the rest of West Marin, is that there's a bill called Senate Bill 9, and the intent of Senate Bill 9 is really less around developing affordable housing and more around kind of addressing patterns of segregation in our communities. And what it is intended to do is it allows somebody to build additional homes on a single lot. So if you have a single home on a lot, you can add an additional home under Senate Bill 9, and most places in the county are not eligible. Or in West Marin, the rest of West Marin is not eligible, but in Woodacre you are. I don't know, Aline, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, that was exactly it. Just the designation as the census urbanized place for Woodacre and SB 9. That's exactly it.
So, sorry, I would just say the constraint, of course, to doing that is going to be, you guessed it, septic, right? So, you know, if there was the community septic system that Woodacre had been considering a few years ago, like that would be, I think, if that was in place, it would be an option that in Woodacre, we may be able to add some additional homes within our community.
So is this applied not just to single, like A-dos and J-dos? I mean, A-dos, but also to other developments within Woodacre?
Yes, you can, under Senate Bill 9, you can actually build another home on your property, right? So it isn't just an accessory dwelling unit. You can actually build another home on the property.
Well, I was thinking more about larger developments, if there was a possible site that was not specifically for, adding an additional home on an individual homeowner's property, but another site where there could be a higher density. Is that?
I think that's a separate issue, right? I think that this Senate Bill 9 is really just about additional homes on existing single unit lots, but the designation that we have, our default density, applies across the whole county. So even within areas that are West Marin and are rural, we still have the same default density of 20 units an acre from the state. It's the same thing across the whole unincorporated part of the county.
Thank you.
Got a question from Stacy in the chat. If the county will get credit for affordable lower density projects when approved or developed?
Yes, absolutely. So there's two pieces of the housing element. So one is where when you are adopting your housing element, as we talked about, part of that requirement is to include a list of sites that are zoned appropriately, et cetera, are feasible for lower income units and for income or for units at all income levels. And then that's required in order to get your housing element certified. But then on an annual basis, we submit an annual progress report, it's called. So in April of every year, we report back on the prior year about the progress that we've made in implementing our housing element. So we look at how many new homes have we developed and at what incomes are they developed and how long did it take them to get developed. So we have to track them through that whole development process. And then we also report on progress of implementing our programs and policies. And so Stacy's question about whether we get credit for it, we do in that annual progress report. So if a site develops with 10 units of affordable housing that we weren't anticipating, that wasn't on our sites list, we still get to count those in our APR or annual progress report.
Thanks, Lily. I'm seeing one more here in the chat. And if folks have questions, remember just to raise your hands. There's one from Carolyn about the buy right process and whether, if not, that applies to West Marin.
So it applies to West Marin unless it's in the coastal zone, and the coastal zone is different, but not all of West Marin is in the coastal zone. So some by right programs or policies could apply in West Marin. So yes, they could.
Great. Carolyn, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on that. Okay, so for those of us who do read the code, is there going to be some way to tell which of the code amendments apply to urban and urbanized areas but don't apply to West Marin? Are we going to be able to tell what distinctions there are?
So the SB 9, the Senate Bill 9 ordinance that was already adopted earlier this year, and it distinguishes where it says where it applies, and if there some things. If they're in the coastal zone, we'll have to also do a local coastal plan amendment to apply those changes. And that is also distinguished. So that's kind of a roundabout way I'm getting to the answer of yes, they will be distinguished if they're where they're applicable to and whether it's only in the coastal zone or if it's for the rest of the county. And just to clarify, when we say West Marin, I think that in general, that has, for most people, it has a broader applicability and it isn't just the coastal zone. So there's a distinction not between West Marin and the rest of the county, but between coastal zone and non-coastal zone.
Thank you.
Great. There's two questions here from Morgan. One, what is the timeline and plan for CDA to work with the communities in West Marin to update community plans to address areas that are not in alignment with the countywide plan? This is essential for community planning in the rural villages. And then two,
Let's just do one at a time.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not going to remember the first one otherwise. Okay, so the first one is about timeline for updating community plans, and that is a separate board process that the board has, and I don't have that in front of me, but they have adopted a policy around updating community plans, which is not my exact world. So I'm not super familiar with what that timeline is or what that process is, but that is a separate piece of it. The amendment that we are making to the countywide plan or to the community plans is really very laser focused on having the sites that are included in the housing element be able to develop consistent with the housing element and to align if there's any discrepancies between the community plans and state law. So if there's barriers to multifamily development, as we mentioned. So those will go into effect when the board adopts the housing element. That will be the board will be adopting. They have some busy days in January, but there's all these packages that they'll be adopting. One is the housing element, the safety element, the other amendments to the countywide plan, the development code changes, and the rezoning. So all of those things will be considered by the planning commission and the board. And then we can follow up about the information that the board has adopted and their timeline and process for identifying community plan updates. So let's just make a note of that, Elena and Edgardo, about following up on that. Okay, let's go to the next question.
Great. And then the second question is, what is the timeline on the local coastal program, the LCP's environmental hazards chapter update to account for the coastal zone? Maybe Leslie, do you have any information you can share on that?
I can say that there's a lot of work happening on that now, but I would be reluctant to speak to the timeline right now. There's a certain point at which we lose control over the timeline, but there is a lot of work being done right now with the planners at the Coastal Commission and our planners.
But we can follow up if there's any other information. I don't know if there is or not, but if there is, we can confirm that.
Great. I see, Steve, you have your hand raised. If you want to go off mute.
Maybe say his last name.
Steve Antonaros. While we wait for Steve, I'll just read this next question from Jacqueline around how does short-term rentals impact this plan? So I'll just start off by saying that we do have a program identified in the housing element to address the impact of short-term rentals on the housing market, especially in West Marin. So there is a program in there. You can find it in chapter 5 of the housing element. We'll drop the link in a second. So there's a specific program to limit short-term rentals in Marin. Lily, anything to add more?
Yeah, I would just, two things. So the program to look at short-term rentals and their impact was really based on what we heard in these forums from folks like you, that this was an issue that came up over and over in West Marin. So that is kind of the genesis of that piece of it. But also, I would note that under the state regulations, even if we're able to move homes from that commercial use as a short-term rental back into the residential market, they don't count towards our housing element. And we through our sites, we still have to demonstrate site. So even if we had like 1,000 homes that were being used as a commercial use as short-term rentals, and we are able to get them back into the rental market, we still would have to demonstrate the sites under the state law. So just distinguishing those between, like, this is a community need that we heard and an interest from the community, but it doesn't count towards our sites.
Thanks for that, Lily. Steve, if you're able to speak, and if not, you can always enter your question into the chat. We have another question here from Ken. Following up on Morgan's question, does CDA plan to involve the communities in the community plan updates, and what would the process look like if we have a sense of that?
So again, if there's a community plan update, when community plan updates happen, that there's an extensive community process. And that is always part of those updates. And so, you know, as communities are identified, the next community plan update that the board has identified is Marin City, and that would involve a lot of community engagement and a lot of community outreach. And so if a community in West Marin was identified to have their community plan updated, then absolutely, yes, there would be, but I don't have a timeline on any other community plan updates other than Marin City, which has been identified. And there is some grant dollars that are associated with that.
So 2 more questions here. I'll start with the second one because it's related. Just someone asking for clarification on the countywide plan and community plan, whether if it's only for parcels identified in the housing element or for development generally. And I think you touched on this, but if you just want to elaborate again.
Yeah, so the community plan amendment will be to any sites that are in the housing element are needed to meet our RENA, that if there's a conflict between what the other policies in the countywide plan and the community plan, then they will be in effect. So again, just to meet the county's RENA, it's not all of them. There wasn't a second part. No, there was a different question. Okay, so.
And then there was a good question from Owen around whether there's a requirement to produce a certain number of units per year or just the total by the end of the cycle.
Yeah, so there's not an exact that you have to do this many number of units. I mean, you could project it out, but there is something called, and there's something called Senate Bill 35. And if you're in, I think, year 2 of your planning cycle and you're not on track to meet your lower income housing needs, then you can be subject to Senate Bill 35. And what that means is if a site is eligible and includes a portion of that project is affordable, then they can do by right zoning, even if it isn't on one of the sites that you've identified for by right zoning. And we have one project in Marin City, which went through this, and they didn't have to meet a lot of the county standards, and they didn't have to go through the regular discretionary review process. They got to just basically, submit their project and get approved. And there's actually 3 of them right now pending in San Rafael, Senate Bill 35 projects. And so that's the repercussion if you're not kind of on track to meet your lower income units when you submit your APR. So let's just get to those last few questions. And I know that our translator needs to leave, so let's try to get through. I'm going to give really short answers, and if we need to, we'll follow up.
Yeah, sounds great. So there's one here around the growth of companies like Picasso, essentially time sharing a single family home amongst 8 owners. Is the county considering prohibiting timeshares?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting model that we'll have to look at, and it's a little bit like whack-a-mole, where we are like trying to react to short-term rentals, but meanwhile something else has been invented. So I think it's something that Napa is a little farther ahead of us with that, but we would definitely look at that in that kind of short-term, the impacts of it the same as we would when we do that short-term analysis. So I think we'll look at it through that short-term rental program. Yes.
Great. And I think our last question for the evening, and if there are others, we're happy to answer them in a follow-up. Feel free to drop your questions. But state comments requested more information on the interest of property owners whose parcels were identified. How do you plan to address that?
Right, so that's particularly around housing that is for lower income. And we have a number of our sites where there are development proposals on them in some early stages. We'll be including that information. And then as we go through the rezonings, there'll be notices that go out to property owners and surrounding property owners to notify them of the proposal. So, you know, with a number of our public agencies, which was part of the comment, we'll be reaching out to, you know, religious institutions around their interest in development. There's a new program that we're working with that is really intended to help religious institutions develop housing, particularly affordable housing. And so we'll be offering that options of participating in that program, which helps people with pre-development funding. So there's a number of ways that we'll be addressing that.
Great, thanks, Lily. I think that's all the questions that I'm seeing for now, but I am going to drop our email in the chat and just let you all know that we are open to any questions you have. Please feel free to email us, housingelement@marincounty.org. You're welcome to attend other community sessions. We'll also have the meetings that Lily mentioned. Our next one is the board meeting on the 15th on the draft environmental review, followed with our first 5 meeting. You can find links to that on our website. I think with that, we'll end the evening. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for your interest. And we look forward to seeing you as this progresses more.
Thank you all. Good night.